Ensure the choir list is ready, Serena.
I have it right here, Papa.
You are the heart of this church. I wish I wasn't.
I just do what I must, Papa.
Humility is a wonderful grace, my dear.
The congregation looks forward to Sunday, Papa.
They look forward to your light, Serena. I am just a simple servant. Truly, you are the golden girl of Zion.
I hope I never disappoint you.
Stay away from the worldly distractions, daughter.
I know the rules of this house.
Carnival season is coming. Guard your heart.
My heart is safe here with you.
Keep it that way, please, my child.
The Golden Girl and the Rhythm of the Streets. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass of Zion Church, casting long, colored shadows across the office where I spent my days. Being the golden girl of the congregation was a role I had stepped into before I even knew I was acting. My father, Pastor Thomas, sat at his mahogany desk, his presence as steady and unyielding as the stone walls of the sanctuary. As I organized the choir lists, his words of praise washed over me, a reminder of the expectation I carried on my shoulders like a mantle. He spoke of grace and humility, of guarding my heart against the worldly distractions that swirled outside our doors, especially with Carnival season approaching. I nodded, offering the perfect, compliant smile. While beneath my floral print dress, I felt the familiar, quiet weight of a life lived entirely for someone else. Miles away, the heat of Port of Spain was a different beast entirely. The streets were humming, vibrating with the kind of kinetic energy that I only ever read about in forbidden novels. When Kylo stepped out of that sleek car, the crowd didn't just cheer, they surged. He was the antithesis of everything my father taught me, drenched in charisma, wearing his success like a second skin. Watching the way he handled the adulation with a grin that seemed to challenge the very air he breathed, I felt a strange, jarring spike of jealousy. He was free. He was loud. He was everything the pastor's daughter was strictly forbidden to be. The collision was inevitable, though I didn't expect it to happen in the produce aisle of the local market. Mrs. Ali was weighing my mangoes when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. I turned, and there he was, Kylo, the soca superstar, looking entirely out of place amidst the piles of fruit. Our exchange was brief, a polite intersection of two different universes. But when he looked at me, he didn't see the church girl. He saw a person. He laughed off my father's disdain for his music, suggesting that my father should listen to his rhythm at least once. It was a preposterous idea, of course, but as I walked away, his words lingered like a catchy tune I couldn't stop humming. Back at home, the evening meal was a quiet affair, punctuated by my father's sharp disapproval of the noise emanating from the streets. He saw Kalilo as a moral threat. I saw him as a mirror. I spent the dinner hour nodding at the right moments, shielding my thoughts behind the mask of the dutiful daughter. I knew the weight of our name, the expectation of purity, of example, of being the light. My father believed I was his masterpiece, the reflection of his own holy testimony, and the guilt of my curiosity felt like a cold stone in my stomach. That night, alone in my bedroom, I stared out at the distant, glittering lights of the city. The silence of the house felt less like peace and more like a vacuum. I thought of Kalilo's confidence, the way he seemed to thrive in the chaos, and I wondered if the life I was living was a blessing or a burial. I told myself it was just a dream, a fleeting moment of distraction that I would shake off by morning. I curled up under the covers, repeating the mantra of my existence. Just be the light, Serena. Just be the light. But as I drifted off, the memory of that market rhythm beat against my ribs, refusing to be silenced. The community square was the heartbeat of our town, a place where news traveled faster than the breeze. When Kaelo arrived, he didn't just walk into the square, he commanded it, turning the morning air into a stage for his charisma. I stood beside my father, Pastor Thomas, feeling the stark contrast between us. My father, a monument of rigid disapproval, and Kaelo, a man vibrating with the kind of life that made the mundane seem dull. Watching the way the crowd gravitated toward him, I felt a treacherous flicker of admiration. When Kaelo approached us, his smile was disarming, but my father treated him like a contagion. As we were whisked away, the stinging admonishment from my father to stay away echoed in my ears, making me feel like a child caught reaching for a forbidden fruit. Back at the church hall, the atmosphere was suffocating. Hanging decorations felt like setting the stage for a performance I was tired of giving. Mrs. Baptiste, with her keen, judgmental eyes, didn't hesitate to remind me that everyone was watching. She cloaked her warning in concern, but it was clear. My reputation was a fragile piece of glass, and my father held the hammer. She hinted that I had looked at him twice, as if one glance were an innocent mistake, and two were a betrayal of my station. I parried her comments with practiced grace, but her reminder that I was the golden girl felt less like a compliment and more like a surveillance report. I wanted, just for a moment, to be a person, not a monument. Sunset at the park provided a brief, stolen sanctuary. I was trying to lose myself in the pages of a book when Kaelo appeared, his presence startlingly casual. We talked, not of church or sermons, but of expectations and the heavy, invisible chains of a life dictated by others. He told me about leaving home, about the agonizing struggle to choose himself over the duty that had defined him. It was the first time someone had looked at me and acknowledged that my life was heavy. He saw the person beneath the floral print and the expectation. And for a few minutes, the world didn't feel quite so narrow. The walk home was a march into a storm. My father had been watching, his disapproval radiating off him before I even reached the door. The confrontation in his study wasn't a conversation, it was a trial. He spoke of worldly temptations as if they were demonic forces, his insistence that I stay away from Kaelo feeling less like guidance and more like an attempt to keep me in a sterile, controlled vacuum. I gave him the promise he needed to hear, the one I had been trained to deliver since childhood. I bowed my head and promised to show him my strength. But as I turned away, the word untarnished felt like a label on a bottle I was desperate to pour out. That night, alone in the dim light of my room, the mirror held a stranger. I looked at my reflection and saw the golden girl my father adored, but I felt the heat of Kaelo's words burning through the mask. I was trapped between two worlds, the warm, rhythmic freedom Kaelo represented and the cold, unyielding perfection my father demanded. I tried to pray, to find the strength my father urged me to seek, but my mind kept drifting back to the bench at sunset and the way the world had felt so much wider there. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to repeat the liturgy of my life. But beneath the rhythm of the prayer, a new beat was beginning to pulse, one I wasn't sure I knew how to stop. The vestry was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of silent prayer, but that morning it felt like a trap. When Kaelo appeared in the doorway, his presence was a jarring intrusion of color into the grey monotony of my duties. I clutched the concert flyer in my prayer book, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't just want to drop off a flyer, he wanted to pull me into the orbit of his world, a world where reputation wasn't a currency to be guarded, but a constraint to be shattered. I told him to leave, my voice sharp with the fear of being discovered, but beneath the fear was a treacherous thrill. He called my reputation a heavy chain, and for the first time, I couldn't deny that he was right. By the afternoon, the church hall was thick with the scent of floor wax and judgment. Mrs. Baptiste had eyes that seemed to see through my skin, tracking the subtle shifts in my behavior that I hadn't even realized were visible. When she pressed me about the singer, her words about glass and fragility felt less like concern and more like a threat. She wasn't asking about my soul. She was gauging the structural integrity of my compliance. I realized then that I was a prisoner, not just of my father, but of the entire congregation, each member serving as an unpaid guard, watching for the first crack in the Golden Girl's veneer. That evening, the alleyway behind the church became the site of our first real conversation. Hidden in the shadows, far from the streetlights that dictated who I was supposed to be, Kalo didn't speak to the pastor's daughter, he spoke to me. He saw the hidden fire I had spent a lifetime trying to extinguish. I admitted that the thought of taking control of my own life was terrifying, and he simply called it freeing. I gave him a tentative, whispered promise. I might come to the show. It was a surrender of the rules, a quiet act of rebellion that felt like stepping off a ledge. I was playing with fire, and for the first time, the heat didn't feel like a punishment. The walk back into the church lobby was a descent into an interrogation. My father and the elder were waiting, their collective gaze acting like a physical force. When I stumbled over my excuse about organizing holiday boxes, their skepticism wasn't just palpable, it was inevitable. The confrontation that followed was the first time I had ever truly pushed back, my voice trembling but clear when I told my father that his version of truth
was just power. The shock on his face was satisfying, but it was quickly eclipsed by the realization that the distance between us had finally become a chasm. I retreated to my room, the silence of the house no longer soothing, but heavy with the weight of an impending storm. Late that night, the storm broke in the one place I thought was safe, my father's office. I had left the flyer in my prayer book, a reckless oversight that would cost me everything. Watching him pace the room, crumbling the colorful paper in his hand as if he were trying to crush my spirit along with it, I realized the full scope of his obsession. He didn't see a daughter who was growing up. He saw a possession that was slipping from his grip. As he picked up the phone to initiate a plan, a way to end this and save me, his laughter was cold, clinical, and terrifying. He wasn't acting out of love. He was acting out of a desperate need to reclaim his authority. And I was the battleground upon which he intended to destroy Kilo. And if necessary, me as well. The morning choir practice was a battlefield where every note felt like a concession. Standing at the front, my voice felt fragile, trembling under the weight of Mrs. Baptiste's relentless, whispered surveillance. They didn't just watch my movements, they dissected them, looking for the telltale rhythm of a girl who had stopped living for the congregation. When my father's voice boomed from the back of the hall, commanding focus, it wasn't a request, it was a tether tightening around my throat. The audacity of Mrs. Baptiste openly discussing my presence in the alleyway as if I were a common criminal pushed me to my breaking point. I didn't just leave the room, I fled it, the sound of their judgment following me like a swarm of hornets. The sanctuary I found in Kilo's back studio was a jarring contrast to the stale air of the church. The room was vibrant, buzzing with technology and the raw, electric promise of creativity. When I stood in the doorway, I felt like an intruder in my own life. A girl who had spent 22 years being the example, suddenly stepping into a space that celebrated the very freedom I had been taught to fear. Kilo didn't see a burden to be managed or a reputation to be guarded. He saw a person. When he played the track he had written for me, the melody wasn't just music, it was an invitation. I held the demo disc like it was a live coal, terrified of what it represented, but unable to let it go. In the market, the facade began to crumble entirely. Maya, my oldest friend, didn't offer the comfort I desperately needed. She offered a mirror, reflecting the town's prejudice. Her accusations of Carnival man and trouble were the same old lyrics set to a new tune. I realized then that my friends didn't love me. They loved the idea of me, the golden girl who never strayed from the path. When I told her I didn't care about the rules, the look of shock on her face was almost comical. She warned me that I would be alone if I left the path. But standing there amidst the scent of ripe fruit and the noise of the market, I realized that being alone was preferable to being a prop. Returning to my father's porch was an exercise in futility. He was waiting, his posture a wall of granite, his questions barbed with a suspicion that was already moving towards certainty. The argument wasn't just about fruit or a friend, it was about agency. When I finally snapped and told him I was tired of living for his image, the air in the yard seemed to shatter. He looked at me not with love, but with the shock of a master whose puppet had suddenly decided to walk away. His decree to go to bed and pray was the last remnant of his power, a hollow command that I ignored even as I retreated, my heart finally beating with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the church. That night, in the safety of my room, the demo disc became my lifeline. As the music played, I danced, not with the practiced, restrained grace of the church girl, but with the messy, vital energy of someone who was finally painfully alive. The cage I lived in was small, cramped, and built of other people's expectations, but I had found the lock. I knew the risks. If they found out, there would be no going back, no return to the pedestal. But as I stared out at the stars, I decided that the risk of being found was nothing compared to the tragedy of being hidden forever. I would go to the show. I would wear a disguise, and for one night, I would belong only to myself. The church vestry had become a staging ground for the Carnival fundraiser, but the vibrant decorations felt like festive chains. I was organizing hymn books, my movements precise and mechanical, when Mrs. Baptiste drifted in like a shadow. She didn't need to ask if I was going to the parade. She wanted to see if the knowledge of Kylo's performance would make me flinch. Her questions were surgical, designed to probe for the lie she was convinced I was harboring. I told myself I had nothing to fear, but her assertion that the truth always finds light made my skin prickle. She wasn't watching me for the sake of my soul. She was watching me for the sake of the church's image, treating my life like a piece of glass she was waiting to see shattered. That afternoon, the alleyway behind the studio became the only place in Trinidad where I could actually breathe. The disguise, sunglasses, and a hood felt absurd, yet it was the only armor I had against the prying eyes of the town. Kylo's promise that he would catch me if I fell felt like a dangerous lifeline. He saw my hesitation as a tragedy, a life wasted in service to expectations, while I saw it as the only safety I had ever known. We were playing with fire in the shadow of a church, but as he touched my face and whispered that love was a necessary danger, the fear began to recede, replaced by a reckless, pulsing anticipation for Friday night. Inside the study, my father was plotting. He treated the Carnival parade route like a tactical map, determined to quarantine me from the chaos of the world. The elder's hesitation, his gentle suggestion that perhaps I was just a young woman growing into her own person, was dismissed with the kind of absolute paternal certainty that made me shudder. My father wasn't just my protector, he was my warden, convinced that his strictness was a divine duty. Hearing him speak of my obedience as the highest form of love made the air in the room feel heavy with stagnant, suffocating piety. He didn't want me to be happy. He wanted me to be a reflection of his own righteousness. By night, the kitchen felt like an interrogation room. Mrs. Baptiste had returned, her tone shifting from veiled observation to overt pressure. She insisted that the tone was whispering, that the golden girl was straying, and that I needed to return to the path. When I finally told her that my life was not her foundation, the shock on her face was almost satisfying.
She warned me that growth is painful and that it breaks everything down. But for the first time, I didn't fear the wreckage. If my whole life had to be dismantled for me to finally exist, then let it break. I was tired of being the example. I wanted to be the reality. That night, in the solitude of my room, I prepared for my disappearance. The mask and hat I laid out on my bed looked like a costume for a play I had never rehearsed. Yet they felt more honest than any floral dress I had ever worn. I kept telling myself that I wasn't committing a crime. I was just going to a concert. Just going to hear music. Just going to feel the rhythm of a world I had been barred from. But in the quiet, the fear returned. I was the pastor's daughter, the golden girl of Zion. And if I stepped into the light of that stage on Friday, I would be committing treason against everything I had ever known. And as I drifted off, I realized with a jolt of exhilaration, I didn't care. Friday was coming, and I was finally going to be Serena.
The church fundraiser was meant to be a night of celebration, but under the garish lights, the atmosphere felt like an executioner's block. I stood in the back, the mask and hood a suffocating barrier between me and the life I had known. When the elder's gaze locked onto me, I knew the game was over. The ensuing chaos wasn't a slow reveal, it was a detonation. As I bolted for the door, my father's voice rang out, not with the comfort of a parent, but with the cold, absolute judgment of an authority figure who had just been defied. When I finally pulled off the mask, I didn't see the light I had been told to be. I saw the horror on his face, the realization that his prize had finally escaped the display case. His words, "disowned until you repent," didn't feel like a punishment. They felt like the first breath of air I'd had in years. I didn't run to a hideout. I ran to the stage, the one place where I knew the truth couldn't be silenced by a hymn. When I arrived, breathless and sobbing, Kalo didn't ask for explanations. He offered a stage. The crowd was a blur of lights and anticipation, and as he pushed me into the spotlight, the fear that had defined my life suddenly transmuted into adrenaline. I grabbed the mic, not as the pastor's daughter, but as Serena. When I sang, the melody wasn't about grace or duty, it was a confession of survival. The roar of the crowd wasn't a judgment, it was an awakening. For the first time, the golden girl was truly silent, and the woman beneath her was finally, beautifully, loud. From the church grounds, my father watched the stage like a general observing a lost battle. He didn't see a daughter finding her voice. He saw the destruction of a narrative he had spent decades perfecting. Mrs. Baptiste and the elders stood around him, a phalanx of indignation, confirming that their forgiveness was as conditional as my compliance had been. They didn't want to bring me home, they wanted to purge me. He didn't care that I was happy. To him, my joy was dark, a temporary defiance that had to be stamped out to preserve the order of his kingdom. He turned away, and in that moment, he didn't just disown me, he effectively erased me, turning his back on his own flesh and blood to save his reputation. Backstage, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a cold, raw clarity. Kalo held me, his steady presence the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved. The scandal was already bleeding out onto the streets, the whispers of the town now turning into a public indictment. I had given up the safe, sterile life that had been my only reality, and in return, I had gained an uncertain future and a target on my back. But as I leaned into him, I realized that I wasn't grieving the loss of my safety. I was mourning the years I had wasted trying to earn the love of someone who never saw me as a person. The car ride out of town was a journey into the abyss of the unknown. As the headlights cut through the darkness, I watched my father's posts, a public condemnation of his fallen daughter, flicker across my phone screen before I tossed it aside. The toxicity of the town was being left in the rearview mirror, but the fear of my father's reach lingered like a phantom. Yet as Kalo drove, his hand finding mine, I realized that for the first time, I wasn't running from something. I was running toward myself. The golden girl was dead. The scandal was the talk of the island, and the road ahead was terrifyingly, wonderfully open.
The church hall felt like a courtroom where the verdict had been written long before the opening prayer. My father stood at the podium, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, righteous authority, as he and the elders dismantled my existence piece by piece. Mrs. Baptiste wasn't just observing, she was curating the narrative of my fall, transforming a young woman's search for agency into a morality play for the entire congregation. The decision to cast me out wasn't reached through prayer. It was reached through a collective need to preserve the image of the golden girl by excommunicating the reality of the woman. As they spoke of justice and purity, I realized that the church didn't want a member. It wanted a reflection of their own narrow, sterile version of God. My trip to Kalo's apartment was meant to be a search for clarity, but I found only more shadows. The box of files on his floor, police records detailing an assault I had never been told about, hit me harder than the church's condemnation. It wasn't the violence of his past that broke me. It was the deception. He had decried my father's lies while weaving his own, justifying his silence as a form of protection. When I backed away from him, the room felt like it was shrinking. I had traded the rigid, suffocating morality of my father for the chaotic, unpredictable dishonesty of a man who played the victim to keep me close. I was holding the pieces of a shattered trust, and I didn't know which side was more jagged. The town square was no longer a place of community. It was a hunting ground. When Pastor Thomas took to the megaphone, the crowd's response was immediate and visceral, a collective war of rejection that felt like a physical blow. The chanting of "kick him out" was a terrifying reminder of how quickly love can curdle into hate. I tried to slink through the shadows, but Mrs. Baptiste's cry of "there is the girl" turned the tide of the mob toward me. They didn't see a neighbor. They saw an apostate. As I ran, the sound of their cheering at my misfortune served as a final brutal confirmation. My father had successfully turned the town into his own private jury. Backstage at the club, the air was thick with the scent of cheap beer and impending ruin. Kalo was packing, his frantic energy belying his claims of innocence.
He insisted it had been a defense of his sister, a mistake of youth. But to me, it sounded like just another verse in a song I no longer wanted to sing. When he begged me to leave with him, to abandon everything and become a fugitive for the sake of a love built on selective honesty, the choice felt impossible. He was waiting at the station, but for the first time, I saw the price of his life. It was a constant, restless flight. I couldn't be a ghost, and I didn't want to be a criminal. I found myself back in the empty, dark church, the silence pressing against my eardrums. I knelt at the altar, the wood cold against my skin. But for the first time, the sanctity of the place felt like a hollow, theatrical set. My father didn't love me. He loved his authority. Kalo didn't respect my autonomy. He wanted me as a passenger on his own chaotic journey. As I sat in the pews, the choice finally solidified, not as a leap toward either man, but as a total withdrawal from their battlefield. I stood up, left the church for the last time, and stepped out into the night. I wasn't going to the station, and I wasn't going home. I was going somewhere else entirely, to a place where I would finally be the one to draw the map.
The morning light in the pastor's study was unforgiving, catching every speck of dust in a room that had once felt like the center of the universe. My father sat amidst the wreckage of his own composure, staring at a portrait of himself as if searching for a man who didn't exist. When Mrs. Baptiste pressed him about his history with Kylo, the crack in his veneer finally split wide open. He didn't just deny the rumors. He reacted with the visceral, defensive rage of a man whose entire foundation is made of sand. Watching him hit the desk, screaming his claim of righteousness to an empty room, I saw the truth for what it was. My father wasn't a man of God. He was a man of performance. The bus station was cold, a transit point for people running towards something or away from everything. The old man who approached me spoke with the weary authority of someone who had carried a secret too long. His words shattered my reality with surgical precision. My father had not always been a holy man. He had been a gambler, a partner in crime to Kylo's father, and the name Thomas was just another costume he donned to hide from the debris of his past. The revelation that Kylo and I were not just strangers crossing paths, but kin tied by the same blood and the same betrayal, made the air in the station feel heavy and toxic. The entire town was built on the foundation of his fraud, and I had been the unwitting centerpiece of his masquerade. The bus ride was a blur of neon lights and shattered identity. Every mile I traveled was a step away from the girl I had been taught to be, and a step toward a reality I could barely comprehend. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the cold, distant figure of Kylo with the reality of our shared history. Had he known? Had our connection, that inexplicable pull I felt toward him, been the gravitational force of our shared blood? As I watched the landscape dissolve into darkness, the weight of the golden girl persona became unbearable. I realized I was returning not to Kylo the singer, but to my brother. And together, we were the living evidence of the man who had destroyed our parents' lives to secure his own.
The meeting at the station was a collision of two worlds that had been orbiting the same sun of deception for 26 years. When Kilo admitted he had known about the relationship for years, I didn't feel relief. I felt a chilling vertigo. We were siblings, tied by the same lies, each of us having been shaped by the same man's ambition. He hadn't told me because he had been as much a victim of his father's past as I was of his present. As he hugged me, the distance between us vanished, replaced by a fierce protective solidarity. We weren't just two people running from a church. We were the debris of a fraud that was finally hitting the ground. The road ahead under the starlight felt like a passage through the afterlife. Driving through the darkness, the irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The pastor's daughter and the scandalous singer were two sides of the same counterfeit coin. Every mile we put between us and the town felt like a stripping away of a layer of skin. We weren't just fleeing a scandal anymore. We were heading back to finish the job. Tomorrow, the mask would be ripped off the man who had built his kingdom on our stolen potential. We were the end of his lie. And as we drove into the horizon, the only thing that felt real was the weight of the truth we were bringing home.
The sanctuary, usually a place of hushed reverence, felt cavernous and cold as we walked down the center aisle. My father stood at the altar, looking not like a man of God, but like a small, frightened actor who had finally run out of lines. As we confronted him, the echo of our footsteps seemed to mock the years of performative holiness he had forced upon us. He tried to reclaim his authority, calling us a blight, but the word died in the stagnant air of the sanctuary. When we spoke of the records and the man he had betrayed to build this place, his face didn't crumble with regret. It shattered with the realization that his audience had finally stopped believing. At the altar steps, the final mask fell away. He didn't offer a defense, he offered excuses. He claimed he had loved the idea of a family, a chilling admission that we were never people to him, but props in his long-running theatrical production. When Kylo and I confronted him about the debt, the shame, and the cold, calculated way he had kept us apart to protect his legacy, he wept. Not for us, but for the ruin of his own reputation. He begged for time to prepare the congregation, a final, pathetic attempt to control the narrative one last time. But the time for theatre was over. We didn't need to destroy him. We only needed to hand the world the script he had tried to burn. The betrayal hit its zenith at the sanctuary entrance. Mrs. Baptiste and the elders, the very architects of the community's judgment, had been listening from the shadows. Watching the light drain from their faces as they realized their tithes had been funding a fraud was the ultimate vindication. My father's attempt to paint the gambling debts as a long-ago mistake failed against the hard, cold reality of the financial evidence. Seeing the elders strip him of the keys to the church was a quiet, clinical end to his reign. He had spent his life obsessed with order, and in the end, he was undone by the very chaos he had tried to bury.
In the church garden, the air was surprisingly sweet. The weight that had crushed my chest for 22 years, the requirement to be the golden girl, the light, the example, was gone. Kaylo and I walked among the flowers, the stillness a sharp contrast to the collapse happening just a few walls away. We talked not of the past, but of the terrifying, exhilarating blank slate of the future. We had been burned by the same fire, and in the wreckage, we had found the only thing that actually mattered: each other. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time, it was ours to build. As we stood at the town boundary, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors no stained glass could ever replicate. I looked back at the town, the church, and the life that had been a gilded cage, and felt nothing but a profound, detached pity. My father's life had been a show. Kaylo and I were the truth he couldn't hide. And as we drove toward the light of the horizon, the title of Golden Girl dissolved into the dark. I was Serena. He was my brother. And the truth, no matter how hard it had been to reach, was the only home I would ever need.
The morning air at the church gate was sharp and clear, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the last few weeks. As I stood with Kaylo, taking in the sight of the steeple for what I knew would be the last time, I didn't feel the phantom weight of expectations. My father emerged from the rectory, not as a tyrant, but as a man visibly diminished by the collapse of his own narrative. His farewell was quiet, lacking the thunderous judgment of his pulpit. And when he conceded that we were stronger than he had ever been, it was the closest thing to an apology he was capable of. I didn't need his absolution. As we turned our backs on the church, the silence wasn't a punishment. It was the sound of a closing door. In the town square, the faces of the people I had known my entire life were no longer a blur of judgment. Mrs. Baptiste, the architect of my social prison, approached us not with a whisper, but with a surprising admission of regret. Her acknowledgement that happiness was the best gift felt like the final piece of the town's collective awakening. It wasn't just my life that had shifted. The town itself had been forced to look at the cracks in its own foundation.
As we walked through the square, the respectful nods from people who had once called me a traitor proved that truth, while caustic, is ultimately the only thing that allows a community to breathe. At the crossroads, the choice was simple. We didn't need the frantic pace of the city or the oppressive history of the town. We needed the horizon. Choosing the coastal road felt like a baptism, a washing away of the golden girl persona and the debris of Kalo's past. As we drove, the conversation flowed with the ease of people who no longer had to navigate the minefield of secrets. There were no more masks, no more performative piety, and no more performance. Just Serena and Kalo, a sister and brother reclaiming the lives that had been stolen from them by a man's obsession with his own image. The coastal road was a ribbon of light stretching toward the edge of the world. The ocean, vast and shimmering in the afternoon sun, mirrored the terrifyingly wide-open future ahead of us. Kalo hummed a melody, a song born not from the frantic need to impress, but from the simple, honest relief of existing. It was the happiest tune I had ever heard, a composition of survival and recovery. Listening to him, I realized that we hadn't just escaped a cage. We had learned how to exist in the open air, where the rhythm of our lives was finally in our own hands. By sunset, we reached the water's edge. The golden light bathed the beach, turning the waves into liquid fire. A fitting backdrop for the end of the long, arduous journey to ourselves. Standing at the water's edge, I looked at Kylo and saw not just a brother, but the person who had seen me when I was still hiding in plain sight. We were finally, honestly, and perfectly free. The rhythm of the waves was the only thing left to listen to, a steady, eternal pulse that felt like the beating heart of the truth. I smiled, the past a fading shadow, and listened to the music of a life that was finally, truly our own.